Good evening. My name is Joe Gersh, and as George has mentioned, it's my pleasure and honour this evening to introduce the Premier of New South Wales, the Honourable Chris Minns. I joined the board of the Sydney Institute in 2003, some 20 years ago. You get less for murder. Then as now, the Sydney Institute stands for the proposition that ideas matter, that history matters, and that values matter. In a world of disinformation, the need for a forum for the uninterrupted and thoughtful expression of views is more rather than less needed. For the opportunity to participate and for their tireless work, I pay tribute tonight to Gerard and Anne Henderson. I come from Victoria, which is, as you would know, its own world politically. So I'm perhaps a strange choice to introduce the New South Wales Premier, but it's a great pleasure for me to do so. As it would happen, the first opportunity I've had to hear the Premier speak at length was at a rally some 3 weeks ago in support of Israel in Dover Heights, shortly after the inexplicable, brutal, and unprovoked Hamas terror outrage. His was an eloquent, heartfelt, and principled address in support of Israel and in clear and unequivocal rejection of anti-Semitism. Words matter. History matters, values matter. For me, as for so many others that were there that night, Chris made a friend for life. I won't run through the laundry list of Chris's extensive CV, given his relatively tender age. As you know, he was elected to the District of Kogarah since 2015. He was previously the Deputy Mayor of Hurstville from 2007 to 2008. He holds a bachelor's degree from the University of New England in Armidale and attended Princeton University in the United States, where he was awarded a master's in public policy. He's had any number of external involvements, working in the charity sector for a youth mental health charity, and indeed as a firefighter. In fact, you might say to this audience that he has a CV unsullied by an association with capitalism, or as you'd call it these days, a lifetime of service. Chris will speak tonight on a number of subjects, including the very important, vexed, and soon to be dealt with at the Sydney Institute subject of housing affordability. Would you please join me in welcoming the Premier of New South Wales, the Honourable Chris Minns.
Well, thank you so much, Joe. The head table's in the middle of the ballroom, which is why I was such a long distance from there to here. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I'd like to acknowledge Gerard and Anne Henderson. I can't imagine how much thought and work goes into organising a night like tonight. And to provide this night as a platform for ideas and policy debates for the last 3 decades is truly inspiring. Great cities like Sydney need institutions like the Sydney Institute. And they need annual events like this annual dinner. When one looks back at the names of those who've been given the opportunity to present this lecture in the past, Gerard and Anne have helped provide a fascinating and invaluable first draft of modern Australian history, and it's very humbling to give this keynote address this evening. Friends, many of you may not be aware that in 1990, then opposition leader Bob Carr jointly opened the Sydney Institute with the first function in a joint appearance with the then Premier of New South Wales, Nick Greiner. Now, I wasn't at that 1990 event, but I bet that sitting beside him that evening, bucking him up and offering quiet support as Bob rose to speak after the then Premier Nick Greiner would have been his wife Helena. And many of you would have heard the news recently of the terrible health diagnosis for Helena. Helena possessed a quiet dignity that I think people responded to, and has been said over the weekend, Helena Carr was a formidable, successful, independent woman. She led a fascinating life. And as an institution in Sydney herself, I'd like to take the opportunity to acknowledge Helena Carr tonight. Jared, there's no doubt, thank you. Jared, there's no doubt that this annual dinner has changed significantly since its inception in 1990. It's grown in size, new venues have been chosen, the guest list has changed. But let me personally congratulate you for ending the practice of having premiers and leaders of the opposition jointly headline these dinners. There's really no need for it, and I'm happy to summarise the views of the Leader of the Opposition at the end of my address. Friends, it's amazing how your view can change in such a short space of time, because 6 months ago, I'm not sure I would have had that enlightened view. One of the many things my kids make fun of me about are the black and white photos of all the premiers of New South Wales hung in the corridor of my office at Martin Place. Now, the reason they make fun of me is that while all previous premiers are pictured in black and white, my portrait is substantially larger and in full colour. My kids think this is some kind of childish attempt by me to look relevant and modern compared to all my predecessors. And that includes my immediate predecessor, Dominic Perrottet, who's pictured in greyscale and unfairly made to look as ancient as 1807 Premier Charles Cowper. Fortunately, he doesn't have the mutton chops. Now, rest assured, I've got nothing to do with the placement of photos in the Premier's office, but it does put your time in office in its rightful, humble existence. I'm just one in a line, and sooner or later, I'll move to black and white, and a new colour original will be put ahead of me. But as I do look back, I look back in admiration at the vision and resilience some of the great premiers of New South Wales have had in Australia's largest state. One of them was Henry Parkes, who, in addition to being the father of federation in Australia, had the singular achievement of converting part of Moore Park into Sydney's first Taronga Zoo. That was before the golfers kicked out the monkeys in 1916. We have no plans on returning the monkeys. The golfers are way more organised than zoo life. Another Premier, William McKell, who was Premier during the Second World War, worked with the Curtin government to accept large-scale immigration from countries other than the United Kingdom into Australia. Now, that decision changed our country and unambiguously transformed New South Wales at the same time. If only those leaders in 1945 knew that their big leap into a new and potentially unpopular policy would in fact work beyond their wildest dreams, and that Australia would be larger, successful and wealthy country, respected around the world, with a functioning, harmonious multicultural community. I think it would have given them great confidence to take such a big decision, a decision that many in their party were at the time at odds with. There were two key policy areas that formed the basis of that success. Number one was the principles of our multicultural community, and number two was more housing for everyone. I want to speak about both of those issues in turn and explain why both of them are relevant today as they were in the middle of the Second World War, when Australia was a very different place. Friends, recent events in the Middle East have undeniably had an impact on social cohesion here in Australia. Like many of you, I was shocked to see on Sydney's streets in recent weeks naked and unbridled racial hatred and anti-Semitism. Many people I've spoken to in recent times firmly believe that this kind of public display of hatred was a thing of the past and couldn't happen in our modern, diverse communities of today. That's particularly so given in our streets and suburbs and communities, we seem to live amongst each other peacefully, not simply in tolerance of one another, but increasingly celebrating each other's foods, culture, and holidays as if they were our own food, culture, and holidays. The horror I felt as Premier, seeing those scenes on the forecourt of the Opera House several Mondays ago, was compounded by the fact that my job as Premier was to protect that space as an area where the Jewish community could come together on that night. So let me say loud and clear that there is no place for hate speech in our community or our country. And I can tell you that the New South Wales Police have already prosecuted those spewing violent language, and the government will take all steps to ensure that bad faith actors don't pull apart our community at the seams. While it's important to note that it's important to not conflate those concerned about the war in the Middle East or those who have worries about civilian lives in Palestine or Palestinians with the worst aspects of anti-Semitism, their voices must be heard, and peaceful protest is a fundamental part of civic life. However, civil society must unite and declare without qualification that naked displays of racial vilification will never be part of Australia that we want to live in. Nor will we tolerate or accept that the lighting of the Opera House is an excuse justifying hate speech and calls to violence on the streets of Sydney. I still believe we have the most successful multicultural community in the world, but we have to work at it. And part of that success is a common understanding that we will not tolerate the public commons as a platform for vilification. That is unambiguously the view of the New South Wales government. These are fundamental principles laid down in custom and law that have made our community tick, the guide rails that have allowed Australia to grow in peace and prosperity since the end of the Second World War. As important as these civic customs of politics are, the importance of the built environment, in this case housing, is also important for Australia. We see some familiar problems when looking back at the issues faced by governments at the dawn of Australia's push to populate or perish. Back then, the New South Wales government that estimated that housing shortages would be in the tens of thousands following the war, and work needed to begin immediately to bridge that gap so as to provide a place for returning diggers to live in and accommodate Australia's new migrants who were about to call our country home. Now, despite bumps, it was an undeniable success. The National Archives report, housing construction made remarkable progress, with the number of house starts exceeding annual targets. By March 1949, 132,000 houses and flats had been constructed since the end of the war, and an estimated 600,000 people were now living in these new homes. In proportional terms, this was a massive housing boom. And we need a similar housing construction boom in our state right now. The simple truth is, we don't have enough well-located homes for the people who make up our city. If we're going to tackle this crisis, our city is going to have to change. Cities are not museums. They're homes to millions of people. And every day they're changing. In a city like Sydney, every day we are welcoming new migrants or new visitors. Families are welcoming new babies and, sadly, farewelling loved ones. The people who call Sydney home are never the same from one day to the next. And that's why we need to have an honest conversation when we ask ourselves, is our city keeping pace with the scale of change that's happening around us? Is it providing good homes for everyone? And the answer is no. Housing affordability and availability is the singular crisis facing both the people of New South Wales and its government. The numbers tell the story. Across Australia, we need to build 1.2 million dwellings over the next 5 years. That's 377,000 homes in New South Wales alone. But we build fewer homes compared to other states. And it's a direct cause as to why housing costs in New South Wales are larger and higher than other states and jurisdictions. Since 1992, this state has built 6 dwellings per 1,000 residents on average. Victoria's built around 8, and Queensland's built 9 per 1,000 respectively. Last year, in overall terms, we built 48,000 new dwellings in New South Wales compared to Victoria that completed 59,000. The median house price in Sydney is over $1 million, almost $200,000 more than the next most expensive capital city, which is Canberra. Rents have gone up 13%. Apartment rents have gone up a massive 28%. And the median rent for a Sydney apartment is now $670. That's a full $120 more than the next most expensive capital city. According to the Grattan Institute in 2000, the median dwelling in Greater Sydney sold for around 6.5 times for a mid-career teacher's salary. In 2022, the same home cost 14 times that salary. Now, these numbers add up to paint a damning picture. Putting it simply, when it comes to housing, Sydney for too long has not kept up with changing and growing populations. And if we're going to tackle this crisis, we need to think big and bold, and we need to act fast. It starts with changing the planning system and the need for infill. Like all major cities, the way Sydney is laid out is defined at least partly by the geography of the state. The planning system in New South Wales has failed to allow enough well-located homes to be constructed for our growing population. And when it has given the green light to housing, for too long the answer's been to allow new housing on the western fringe, the outer suburban fringe of Sydney. But Sydney is not like Melbourne, where it has an endless plain. Sydney can't keep expanding north and west and south because we're ringed by waterways, bushland and mountain ranges. So increasingly, density makes perfect sense. The New South Wales Productivity Commission found that that kind of infill development close to existing infrastructure is far more cost-effective to the taxpayer of the state than greenfield housing. In fact, it could be up to $75,000 cheaper per home. For too long, the planning systems only work for those who already own in parts of Sydney. And let's be honest here, this has been largely at the expense of young people. The New South Wales government does not want to see Sydney become a city divided between those living comfortably in their own homes and those struggling to find a home where they can afford to buy or to rent. And attacking this growing inequality is going to drive our government every single day. 10 years ago, the big question for young people in Sydney was, would I ever be able to afford to buy a house in New South Wales? For many, the question they're now asking is, will I even be able to afford to rent one? Over the past 4 months, we've announced significant changes to the planning system. These changes give both private developers and public social housing providers a more direct and smoother route to planning approval. They seek to allow for greater height and floor space allowances for developers seeking to build apartment buildings. We've incentivised developers to include more affordable housing as part of their plans. We've made it simpler for social and public housing providers to construct new developments that are larger and provide more new housing. I know the Planning Minister, who I think is here tonight, and the Minister for Housing, who's here tonight as well, are working with the industry to get these changes right because in many instances they've never been introduced into our planning system or our laws that govern approvals in the state. But we are listening to industry and we are determined to get it right, even if it's not going to be done overnight. The next wave of planning reforms and our drive to build more new homes will be based on a number of principles. Number one, we need to increase density. Number two, we need well-located houses and apartments near well-connected transport infrastructure. Number three, we need more social and affordable housing. Number four, we need well-designed houses and apartments fit for purpose in 21st century Sydney. And number five, we need to do it all quickly. These 5 points are driving our thinking when it comes to designing the planning reforms of the future. Now, I'm not going to detail all of our proposed planning reforms tonight, and that includes confirming or denying the leak on the front page of today's Sydney Morning Herald. Suffice to say, the challenge facing the government is a big one, and the scale of the policy solution will have to be big as well. Not everyone will like our changes, particularly around density. And there are big interests that believe that infill development will be a net loss for them. And while I believe their concerns are overblown and that density done well is the key for our great city, the vehemence of their opposition just can't be denied. The great reforms, both nationally and in New South Wales, have been, at the end of the day, bipartisan. And that's why tonight I want to make a big and open offer to the New South Wales opposition to come in, to be briefed on our reforms when they're ready, not just on the front page of the Herald, and come on board with the idea of more density and more supply for Sydney, so that the next generation of young Australians can write their chapter into the history of this great city and not leave for somewhere cheaper in another jurisdiction or another state. It could end up being a policy solution that both parties can own and celebrate as their own. And friends, I'm happy to share credit. I'll even go as far as putting up a colour photo of the Leader of the Opposition on my office corridor. But whether the opposition come on board or not, we're determined to pursue this reform because we see no other way for Sydney. Cities need to strike a balance between dynamism and heritage, and it's undeniably the case that governments at all levels have not done enough. But with the right arguments, with the right reforms, and with the right allies, we can do a number of things. We can show the people of Sydney that in solving the housing crisis, we can create a better Sydney in the process. We can have thousands of new homes built in great locations with world-class public transport. We'll create apartment buildings designed for 21st century Sydney in suburbs full of green space where we don't sacrifice livability for density. Friends, the next few years are going to be critical, and with the help of all of you in our body politic, I know we can be successful. Thank you so much for tonight. Really appreciate it.